Hello class, welcome back. It's great to see you. This unit series is called Types of Sentences. There are 7 lessons in this unit. These 7 lessons, we will be studying the 4 types of sentences: simple, compound, complex, and compound complex. Before I begin the lesson on these sentence types, I want to make sure that you have opened or printed the guided notes page that goes with this lesson. This will help you follow along in the video and keep your brain active. You can find this handy document either on my live worksheet page, in a link in the description below, or if you're in my TS99 class, I attached it to an email that I sent with this week's work. If you look at your screen now, you will see what these guided note pages look like. There's a different note page for each of the 7 lessons. Make sure you look at the title at the top of each of the note pages and make sure it matches the title of the video. Let's go ahead and begin talking about the sentence type for today. This lesson is the 5th lesson in the series called Types of Sentences. It's the 3rd part of the series of complex sentences. Now, before you start the video, make sure you have your guided notes for complex sentences titled Relative Pronouns. Let's go ahead and begin talking about relative pronouns and their place in complex sentences. So we'll continue to unpack these complex sentences, but we're going to review some of the things that we have already talked about. In the first lesson, I explained in detail about subordinating conjunctions. The second lesson helped you learn the punctuation rules for those conjunctions. In this lesson, I'm going to teach you about relative pronouns and how they play a part in complex sentences. Make sure you understand those past lessons. Maybe we'll just take a quick review on those concepts first. Then we'll go ahead and start to look at the 6 common complex relative pronouns and how they're used in complex sentences. So let's review what a complex sentence is. Remember that a complex sentence is formed when you combine a dependent clause, which is not a complete sentence, with an independent clause, which is a complete sentence. That formula for a complex sentence is D, dependent clause, plus I, independent clause. Remember that dependent clause is a group of words that may contain a subject and a verb, but it's still a fragment. And it's a fragment because it begins with a subordinating conjunction or a relative pronoun. We had practice putting subordinating conjunctions before a sentence, and now we're going to look at the relative pronouns. The example that I used in the previous lesson, using a subordinating conjunction, was even though she owns a puppy. So by itself, she owns a puppy is a simple sentence. It's independent. It's complete. But when we put the subordinating conjunction before that simple sentence, even though she owns a puppy, it becomes a dependent clause or a fragment. Now, look, we do the same thing with relative pronouns. Whomever owns more puppies it needs more. You see how that works? It becomes a fragment or a dependent clause. On your screen, you see a common list of relative pronouns. It's a good idea to write these 6 down and memorize them. It'll be easier for you to identify complex sentences and know how to punctuate them if you know what these 6 common pronouns are. So, relative pronouns refer to an antecedent. Now, an antecedent is a word or a phrase or a clause that often refers to something else, and it's usually following the relative pronoun. It always begins the dependent clause. So just like subordinating conjunctions, relative pronouns always begin dependent clauses. When you use a relative pronoun, it's often the subject of the dependent clause. Let's look at some examples. Here we see an independent clause or a simple sentence. It says, I read a book. That is an independent clause. It's a simple sentence. It has the subject, I, and it has a verb, read. I read a book. Now, how do I take that independent clause and make it a dependent clause? Well, we put a relative pronoun in front of that independent dependent clause. Let's look at what I did. I used the relative pronoun who. Now the sentence says, who read a book? The relative pronoun is the subject, who, and the verb is read. It's now a dependent clause. So now that you've seen some examples, let's go ahead and try to practice doing the same thing. On your screen, you're going to see 6 sentences. I want you to underline the relative clause and then highlight the independent clause. Now remember that the relative clause is going to start with one of the 6 relative pronouns that we learned on the previous slide. Pause your video while you find these clauses and then turn the video back on when you finish. Then I'll go over the answers. Go ahead and pause your video now. So class, let's see how we did. Here you see where I have highlighted the independent clause and where I underlined the relative clause. Check your answers with mine on the screen and see how you've done. Now that you've had some practice identifying clauses, let's look at a few of the punctuation rules for relative clauses. So the rule for punctuating relative clauses goes like this. Use a comma before and or after relative clauses if the information in the clause is not necessary to understand the sentence. Now, it's important to know that this rule only applies to relative clauses. But let's go ahead and talk about how to decipher whether the information is relative or not relative, or essential or not essential. So here you might want to write down, because this is important if you need to understand how to punctuate this type of sentence. So we have restrictive clauses which are essential. Essential means it's important. You need it in the sentence. For example, here is an example of a restrictive clause that is essential. We have the boy who egged our house came over and cleaned up the mess. Now this information, the red part that you see, who egged our house, is essential. Therefore, we do not use a comma. So think about this. If the information in the clause is essential, we do not need a comma. But if it is a non-restrictive clause, or it's something that is not essential or not important in the sentence, then we do use a comma. Let's look at the example. Josh likes to read with his mom at night, which makes her happy. We didn't need that last part of the sentence. It was not essential. So yes, we did have to use a comma. Let's see if we can practice doing this ourselves. On your screen, you see 5 sentences. I want you to understand that it's important to identify the relative clause. So, underline the relative clause and then highlight the independent clause. If the clause is non-restrictive, which means non-essential or not important, then it does need a comma. If the clause is restrictive and it is essential, then you can leave the sentence like it is, with no comma. Pause your video while you decide on the correct punctuation. Then turn the video back on and I'll go over the answers with you. Go ahead and pause your video now. So class, let's see how you did. To make things a little bit easier, I actually highlighted the relative pronoun in each one of these sentences. That way it would be easier for you to find the relative clause. Let's look at the first example. The boy who is dressed as a ghost looks scary. So that relative clause is essential. So therefore, we did not use a comma. In the example sentence 2, the relative pronoun that separates the candy that you bought at the store is gone. That relative clause is essential, so there is no comma. Number 3 is not essential. If we look at the relative clause, which are both especially disturbing, we realize that it's not necessary in the sentence. So therefore, it does have a comma. It says, the spider and her web, comma, which are both especially disturbing, comma, keep people away from walking that path. Do you see how we could have that sentence without the clause? The spider and her web keep people away from walking that path? That is why this one is not essential and does have a comma. Let's look at number 4. You probably know the girl whom he is talking to. That relative clause is essential and therefore has no comma. And the last one. There is the dog whose owner abandoned her. Once again, that relative clause is essential, so therefore has no comma. So now that we've had some practice on relative pronouns, and in the previous lesson, subordinating conjunctions, let's take a minute and put these 2 concepts together. I'm going to ask you to decide if the dependent clause begins with a subordinating conjunction that we learned in that previous lesson, or a relative pronoun, what we learned in this lesson. You may want to go back and look at your guided notes on subordinating conjunctions to remind you of the most common subordinating conjunctions. Pause your video while you decide, and then turn the video back on and I'll go over the answers. Go ahead and pause your video now. So class, let's see how you did. In each of these sentences, I have highlighted a word that was either a subordinating conjunction or a relative pronoun. Let's look and see if your answers match mine. In sentence number 1, I highlighted the word who. They caught the lady who stole my purse. If you said that's a relative pronoun, you're right. In sentence number 2, I highlighted the word which. The team lost, which is very disappointing. If you said that the word which is a relative pronoun, you got it right. Number 3, I highlighted the word if. If you are not careful, you will crash your new car. If you said that the highlighted word if was a subordinating conjunction, you're right. In sentence number 4, I highlighted the word because. Texting and driving is dangerous because people take their eyes off the road. If you said that the word because is a subordinating conjunction, you got it right. And the last one, number 5, I highlighted the word that. There's the man that built this garbage dump. If you said that the word that was a relative pronoun, you are correct. I realize that was a lot of information in this video. Learning a new language takes time and lots of practice. It can even be more difficult when you can't be in a classroom face-to-face with the teacher. Although there's nothing more that I would like than to be able to be in that classroom face-to-face with you, there is an advantage to having these lessons in a video format. You can always pause the video, write notes and questions, and even repeat instructions that you might need to hear again. Also, don't forget that each of these videos in this series have a guided notes page for you to use. As you watch the video, fill out these guided notes. There's also many activities for you to practice what you have learned. These activities are either in your workbook on the live worksheets, or if you're not in my class, you can find links to these activities in the comments section below. So for now, this concludes today's lesson. But before you go, I'd like to ask you to do a few things. If you enjoyed this video, please show me by hitting the like button here. You can also subscribe to my channel, which will notify every time a new video gets posted. If you have friends or family or other people who you think might enjoy this video, why don't you share it with them? And of course, if you'd like to comment, I'd love to hear from you. Write a couple examples of some of the sentence types you've learned today. And lastly, please know what a blessing it is for me to share my passion with you. Thank you for allowing me to come on this journey with you to learn English. Goodbye for now. I'll see you very soon.